Welcome to Lumon, a nimble new refiner.
Hello, refiners! Welcome to this week's video, which, surprisingly, will have a distinct lack of hell references. But don't worry, I'll still be sprinkling in a couple of little hell-related connections here and there. But instead of descending into Dante's Inferno together, we're switching things up a little bit. This week, we're going to be slipping through the looking glass, chasing the white rabbit, and tumbling headfirst deep down into the rabbit hole. So join me as I delve deeper into the latest episode of Severance, Season 2, Episode 8, Sweet Vitriol. So let's get into it. So starting with, obviously, the biggest thing from this episode, Cobel being the inventor of the Severance ship is crazy. I personally love this reveal because I think it just opens up the possibility of a much better story playing out than I initially anticipated. Up until this episode, I was thinking there is no way there's going to be a happy ending for Mark and Gemma. Like, Mark is just this guy trying to take on Lumon all by himself. He doesn't stand a chance. But now finding out that Cobel might be like their secret weapon that we needed to be on our side, it's making me feel so much more excited and hopeful for Mark and Gemma. So I am, of course, anticipating that Cobel will team up with Mark and they'll actually have somewhat of a chance to fight against Lumon. But I suppose before getting too hopeful about having a happier ending, I think it's best to first explore at least my interpretation of what we saw in this episode and what it all means. So we've now seen that Lumon, at least in the past, used to come to these towns, build ether factories, hire everyone living in the town, including children, and the whole town ends up becoming dependent on them. And not just economically. The layers of control are so complex. They're controlling people through employment, financially, but also infiltrating people's day-to-day life through the religious cult aspect. So also this indoctrination aspect to it all, as well as the addiction to ether. Which is really sad. These people who live here have no hope of not falling prey to Lumon. But if we start exploring the past a bit more, it gets more interesting. So we know from the painting, The Courtship of Kier and Mnemosyne, that it depicts Kier as a stew man, with Mnemosyne being a swab girl in an ether factory. So they met and bonded at the workplace. So this is almost saying that Kier worked at an ether factory before going on to become the Kier Eagan who started Lumon. But it's clearly not a coincidence that Lumon themselves, at least in the past, maybe they still are, but at least in the past, were in the ether business as well. So now I'm wondering, maybe Kier somehow became the owner of the ether factory he worked at when he met Mnemosyne, or somehow the owners of that ether factory were the ones to recruit Kier to then build Lumon together. And I think this original Lumon business was all about selling ether. I think they were probably in the healthcare pharmaceutical company world, and they were probably selling ether to doctors and dentists to use in place of anesthetic, which is what used to happen in the past. Like, before anesthetic came about, ether was used so that doctors and dentists could like perform surgery, things that were like painful for people. They would just get them high on ether so that they didn't feel or experience the pain. And later on in this video, I'm going to be exploring a bit more of the ether history. So we'll definitely dive deeper into that. But what I'm also thinking is that Lumon, Kier, weren't just selling the ether to medical professionals. I think they were straight up ether dealers from the start as well. Like, if we look at Lumon's old logo, which is also on Jaime Eagan's ring, his ring has the old Lumon logo on it as well. The logo is of a bottle full of liquid with a spoon holding said liquid and a drop of the liquid dripping off the spoon. I think this is ether, and ether's name is obviously diethyl ether, which used to be called sweet oil of vitriol. So I think the old Lumon logo is an oil drop of vitriol, which is ether. So Lumon is ether. And as we then saw in this episode, they weren't just selling the ether to doctors and dentists. They were maybe, I don't know how intentional it was, but they were also distributing it to entire towns, getting entire towns hooked on this. Like, they had whole factories making this stuff, pumping it out, having 8-year-olds working in these factories. It's pretty clear to see how easily these people would get addicted to it if they're just being exposed to it every day. And again, this is just another way of keeping people under their control. Like, now that you've got a whole town hooked on your supply, they're going to do whatever you say so that they can keep getting their supply. And to further explore the recruitment and indoctrination of these regular town people into the Kier religious cult side of things, this episode has given me at least a better understanding of Cobel's history, like how she became such a Kier fanatic loyalist. Like, it revealed she's also just another victim of this cult indoctrination. So we see the plaque on the wall that says quarterly something, 4th quarter, year of vision, youth apprentice matron, Celestine Sissy Cobel. So I think this youth apprentice matron is almost like a factory supervisor to the youth, to kids. And we of course see that it was likely Sissy, so Cobel's aunt, that introduced taking ether maybe recreationally to the kids she was supervising, because we see Cobel's friend here say, "Tell her to drop dead for me." And then we see the animosity is mutual, because Sissy then says, "I do not want that hoof peddler on my property," to which Cobel replies, "You gave him thirst for it." So this is definitely saying, you, whatever job you had at the ether factory, you're the one that got him hooked on it. So maybe it was like just the fact that she was a supervisor type person there and was partly responsible for hiring kids to work there, and he just became addicted to it by being exposed to it. Or maybe this is some sort of Lumon previous, like, old-timey management style where they would encourage the supervisors to have the workers use ether to become more docile and compliant, maybe. So I think it was Sissy who initially became the religious fanatic. And we of course see how she was able to become so loyal to them when she later on says there was no town before the factory. So she genuinely believes that Lumon, the Kier religion, almost came down as maybe like a godlike figure with the promise of a better life, of salvation, of giving them a chance to have a better life than just being stuck probably in poverty in this town, which is obviously what ended up happening anyway. Like, we see the current state of the town. But I bet initially the town used to be in a similar state, obviously without the addicts though. And for a short time, they probably were thriving and having a better life, which would just encourage the belief in this religious salvation type thing. Like, it just makes sense that people in a desperate situation would want to believe in something bigger and better than how their current life has been. And of course, we get to see Sissy's shrine, which clearly inspired Cobel's own shrine that she used to have in her basement. This is just wild religious cult fanatic behavior. And of course, if it wasn't obvious enough already that Sissy is clearly still a religious fanatic, the line that Cobel's friend, sorry, I forgot his name, says when they're talking at the ether factory when they initially meet. He says, you know, she still lives by the 9. And this is obviously referring to the 9 core values of Lumon, which we then, of course, get to see on Sissy's shrine as well. Like, she has the 9 core values laid out on cards. And do you know what else is a number 9 reference? Dante's Inferno, the 9 circles of hell. This connection has been in my brain for a while, but I haven't had a chance to mention it in any video yet. So consider this one of my little references to Dante's Inferno. I think the 9 core values, the 9 circles of hell, there's some connection there with the number 9. Now, as I just said, I think it's Cobel's aunt, Sissy, that initially became the religious fanatic in the family and indoctrinated Cobel herself. Because when Cobel and her friend are talking about Cobel's mother, he says he really liked her and that she hated Lumon more than I did. So obviously Cobel's mother died when she was young, seemingly whilst she was away at the Myrtle Eagan School for Girls, since Cobel was unable to do anything about Sissy or her mother, whatever the truth was, of like removing the breathing tube and then dying. So for me, it seems like if Cobel's mother was still alive and well, I don't think she would have turned into the Kier worshipping Cobel we met in like season 1. I think that was all Sissy's doing, Sissy's influence as being the in-place parental guardian for Cobel, since her mother was obviously like bedridden and ill towards the end of her life. And since Cobel's friend was saying how he liked her, but Cobel's like, oh, you barely knew her, I think her mother must have also worked in the ether factories. Like, I literally think every single person living in this town worked in the ether factory. And I now think Cobel's mother died from ether exposure, specifically because of lung damage. Because when I was looking into the real life physical effects of ether, it says that inhaling diethyl ether can cause respiratory irritation, chemical pneumonitis, and chronic breathing problems, which can include coughing, shortness of breath, and respiratory infections. So that obviously makes sense why her mother had this breathing tube towards the end of her life. And I don't think it's clearly shown on this piece of equipment, but I would bet this is a Lumon medical equipment piece, which is super gross because this means that Lumon was the one that caused her to develop these illnesses and then almost pretend to potentially save her with their own equipment, their own machines. But then she still dies and it was all caused by Lumon and she never really stood a chance of surviving. And it's also showing their really gross business practices as well, because it's showing like how they create the problems and are then positioning themselves as the solution as well. So ultimately, what I think Cobel's backstory is that it was her aunt who was initially indoctrinated into the Kier Lumon religious cult aspect. And then because Cobel's mother is severely ill, her aunt is essentially her parental guardian. Her aunt is also seemingly a very good supervisor worker at the factory. So it was probably her good work ethic and devotion to the company that probably got Cobel into the Lumon school, the Myrtle Eagan School for Girls. And it was probably there where Lumon then saw potential in her. And of course, we find out that means they stole her ideas. And what do we see of the rest of the town? Like, what becomes of the rest of the town? Lumon has now poached potential talent like Cobel out of there, but now the rest of the town has become addicted to ether. And of course, this is going to lead to a not very productive, functional workforce if people are always in withdrawal or are constantly high. And we literally hear this kind of sentiment in the beginning of this episode, where this other customer man in the cafe is talking to the waiter guy, Cobel's old friend. He's saying, like, did you hear about what happened up on North Pine? Dutch Stevens kid. How do you flip a 2-ton snowplow? And Cobel's friend says, with stupidity, the apple doesn't fall far from the gutter. I think this accident mess up thing that they're talking about is as a result of everyone being ether addicts. And then it's even more ironic that Cobel's old friend then gives the guy some ether. Like, they're talking about how messed up the workforce in this town now is, seemingly because of ether addiction. But it's like, oh, and here's some more ether addiction as well. And then, of course, for Lumon, as a business, if the entire town isn't productive anymore, they're obviously just going to shut it all down and move on elsewhere. Because what are you going to do with a town full of barely functional people? But Lumon as a business in the present day of the story, I don't know if they're still in the ether business, because they could also be controlling the supply to addicts, like in the town of Salt's Neck that we see, as some kind of shady side business. But I think Lumon's business operations have definitely shifted from ether trade and supply to the Severance chip. So that's also going to be a contributing factor as to why they just closed up the ether factory in this town and moved on. And of course, why would you need chemical ether anymore when you have the Severance chip as a replacement option for an alternative way to not suffer through life? And I think it was Cobel's own personal traumatic childhood experience of being around ether and seeing how it was being used by Lumon as a way to reduce suffering, whilst she's also suffering by being exploited into child labor and drug exposure. So I'm thinking her inspiration for creating the Severance chip was as a way to replace ether. Like, what is a way in which we can erase suffering from parts of our existence, but we're not turning into drug addicts? And potentially dying like her mother, and I'm sure many others in the town have died as well. So I think in her mind, Severance was a way to, firstly, help resolve her own childhood trauma and suffering, but also was a way to appease Lumon and the religious cult side of Kier Eagan stuff by bringing Kier's philosophy to life, of like demonstrating her devotion to this religion, to her to this company. Because there definitely had to be something to Kier's original philosophy that involved this like being free from suffering, here, have some ether kind of thing to it. At least in the Lumon business sense, that's definitely what was going on. But we also see on Sissy's shrine, there's this poster that highlights the work-life balance. And this was clearly from a time before the Severance chip existed. So was Kier originally offering ether as a way to have a better work-life balance? Like, yeah, you suffer at work, but here, have some ether afterwards and enjoy yourself, maybe? And now that I've shared my interpretation and thoughts on what we were told in this episode regarding Lumon and Cobel's history, I also just want to quickly point out the overall imagery and symbolism of this town in this episode. So we see that Salt's Neck is this cold, frozen wasteland. And what does that sound like? The ninth circle of hell in Dante's Inferno, which is depicted as a frozen lake. I've said this in every video I've made about this show, but I think Severance is following Dante's Inferno, and I suspect the story's conclusion might be related to the ninth circle of hell, the frozen lake. And that lines up with all of the visual symbolism of the show. It's a winter show. It's always cold. It's always frozen. So it's as if the show is already telling us we're kind of already there. We're kind of already trapped in Lumon's ninth circle of frozen hell. And in this episode, there's this specific shot where half of the water, the lake, river, whatever it is, half of it is frozen and half of it isn't. And I think this symbolically is showing us that this town is almost entirely trapped in Lumon's ninth circle of hell. But at the moment, the whole town isn't fully frozen yet. So we look at the people in the town, they've been all turned into drug addicts, barely surviving, but the town isn't completely lifeless yet, and that's why not all of the water is frozen over. But we can see their fate on the horizon, right? We can see that this town is hanging on by threads. There's barely anyone living here. There was obviously no children or anything shown. As Cobel says herself in the beginning of the episode, the town's older and frailer than she remembers. So it's like once these people die, I think the whole town will be dead. And I think visually, all of the water, all of the lake, river, whatever, would be frozen over to show how Lumon is Dante's Inferno of hell, and once they're done with you, there's nothing left and everything's frozen over. And as we were just talking about frozen wasteland, frozen lakes, iceberg type stuff, it is now time for me to take you on a deep dive theory iceberg down the Ether Trail, because I have found so many insane connections that I have to share with you. And I think by understanding the history of Ether, it can shed new light on some of Severance's central themes of forgetting, control, and the fragmentation of identity. So let us now begin going deeper and deeper, layer by layer, down the rabbit hole. Starting with layer 1, Diethyl Ether, which I think is code for Dita. I now think the entire Dita story was actually just about Kier's own experiences being under the influence of Ether. I mean, we saw in that painting of him and Imogen, they're just there over a giant vat of Ether being exposed to it. Kier Eagan definitely experienced the effects of Ether. But I think his experiences on Ether made him angry and ashamed. He didn't like how he acted so carefree and frolic-like. And that's why he ended up with almost these two different versions of himself, him being sober and him being high on Ether, and him deciding something needed to be done to tame this carefree frolic side of himself. So I still think Kier had the initial conceptual idea of Severance as a way to tame parts of himself that he had no control over. Because I imagine, obviously working in the Ether Factory, he would have unwillingly been high all the time. So he had to try and figure out a way to tame himself because he couldn't just stop being exposed to it all. But let me give you a brief history on Ether so you can better understand why I'm thinking Kier Eagan was just high on Ether all the time. So now we descend to layer 2, the history of Diethyl Ether. So Diethyl Ether was first synthesized in 1540 by Valerius Cordus, a German botanist, pharmacist, and physician who called it sweet oil of vitriol because it was made by distilling ethanol with sulfuric acid, oil of vitriol. So the term sweet vitriol comes from its sulfuric acid origins and its distinctive sweet odor and numbing effect. And of course, the episode's title, Sweet Vitriol. Now, ether is highly volatile, colorless, and as I said, it has a distinctive sweet smell. It evaporates quickly at room temperature, making it ideal for inhalation-based anesthesia. The chemical structure of ether makes it a non-polar solvent, which contributed to its later use in industrial applications. For example, it was an important chemical that was used to dissolve and shape early plastics and playing cards coatings. And what does this sound like? All of the 3D printed plastic stuff and the cards of the fighting stuff in O&D. So they're clearly, I think, making that stuff with ether still. Now, the words themselves have super interesting layered meanings. So the term vitriol also means bitterness or malice, reflecting the corrosive and destructive nature of sulfuric acid, which ironically, is also the base for ether, which is a substance that takes away pain. And then we have the history of the word ether. So the word ether actually goes all the way back to Aristotle, who believed there were 5 elements: earth, water, air, fire, and a mysterious 5th element that he called ether. While the first 4 elements made up the physical world, ether was the divine celestial substance that filled the heavens. It was believed to be the medium through which light, stars, and even consciousness moved. Later on, scientists used ether to explain how forces like gravity and light could move through space. Isaac Newton described an ethereal medium, while 19th century physicists thought that light travelled through a luminiferous ether. Luminiferous? Lumen! Lumen! So could lumen's name itself actually be a direct reference to ether, as in ether, this hidden 5th element? Like, if lumen's entire goal since the beginning has always been about, like, controlling perception, memory, maybe even consciousness, then maybe their research has always been about harnessing this hidden element, the unseen force that binds reality together. The ether! Now, Aristotle's whole theory of this 5th element was later disproven in the late 1800s, but the word still lingers in modern language to describe invisible forces around us. Like, we have sayings like messages lost in the ether, radio waves passing through the ether. And again, what is the connection to Severance here? The radio waves, the brain waves to do with the Severance stuff. Is it all happening through this 5th element of the ether? Wow, this is some crazy stuff, guys. And now here's some more history of ether as well. So, before its medical use, ether was inhaled recreationally in the 18th and 19th centuries, especially in England, France, and the United States. Ether frolics were social events where people inhaled ether for its intoxicating effects, which included euphoria, laughing, loss of inhibition, a sensation of floating or detachment from the body, dizziness, mild hallucinations, confusion, a loss of pain, and temporary amnesia, awakening with no memory of the event, mirroring the effects of anesthesia. Now, these gatherings were especially popular among medical students and intellectuals who experimented with ether's mind-altering properties. In Ireland and Eastern Europe, ether was even consumed as a liquid mixed with water or alcohol. Because it was cheaper and more accessible than alcohol, it was also used as a substitute during alcohol prohibition in some regions. And now, of course, I have to bring you back to the old Lumon logo of ether. It is ether, this drop, this bottle, this drop, it's ether. They were selling ether for people to drink. But get this right, ether wasn't just used as a party drug. Some people saw it as the moral alternative to alcohol. So during the 19th century, there was the temperance movement, a religious effort to abolish alcohol, and it gained a lot of traction. And their interpretation of ether was that technically it wasn't an alcohol. So some religious leaders actually promoted the consumption of ether as a safe and pure intoxicant in place of alcohol. Apparently, one priest, Father Matthew, even called it a liquor on which a man might get drunk with a clear conscience. So think about this, right? A religious movement was saying that consuming ether was allowed. It was the right kind of intoxication, almost like a moral loophole, an improved indulgence. And what does this also sound like? Temperance? Like taming of the 4 tempers? Temperance? In a religious sense? Encouraging the use of ether? What is this? But guys, that is not all either. Ether. Fun pun. There's even more insane historical connections to explore. So get this. Before 1846, surgery was performed without anesthesia, requiring patients to endure extreme pain. So using ether in placement of an anesthesia made modern surgery possible, allowing for pain-free procedures and safer operations. And in 1846, an American dentist, Dr. William T.J. Morton, first demonstrated ether anesthesia at Massachusetts General Hospital and named it Lethe, after the river Lethe from the underworld Hades in Greek mythology, to emphasize its ability to induce forgetfulness and erase pain. Guys, I'm seriously losing my mind, as you can hear. Now I'm going to explore this whole connection to the river Lethe in just a second, but just to wrap up this history of ether use, from then on into the late 19th and early 20th century, it became widely used in surgeries and dentistries, and was also used during multiple different wars that happened to treat the soldiers. And just as a quick little side point as well, it being used in surgeries and dentistry, that's another connection to all this Lumon stuff, the dentistry stuff, the smile wall. And do you know what's really sick that I'm now thinking? I don't think that version of Gemma's innie that has to be in the dentist room, I don't think she's given anything, like any anesthesia or anything. I think they are performing dentistry on her without ether, without anesthesia, because they're seeing the innie, the Severance chip, the innie version, as a substitute for ether. If that makes sense. I just had to share because I think that's connected. So now let's go down to layer 3, the river Lethe and its parallel to ether. Back to how I just mentioned how Dr. William T.G. Morton first named ether Lethe. I'd like to explore a bit more about the history of this name, of the river Lethe. Now, if you've seen any of my previous videos, especially my video to episode 5, which I'll link above, you will have heard me talk about the 5 rivers of the underworld of Hades in Greek mythology, and how the river Lethe represents, I think, in Severance, the Severance procedure itself. So let me just give you a brief rundown. Now, the river Lethe was known as the river of oblivion or forgetfulness, and it's where souls who had entered the underworld were required to drink from in order to be reincarnated. And once they drank from the river Lethe, they would forget all of their past lives and be able to then reincarnate as a fresh soul without having any of their past life memories. So the river Lethe's whole function essentially was to enforce the cycle of reincarnation. And it was named after the goddess Lethe, who represented the erasure of pain, of self, of past knowledge. And in my video for episode 5, I said that I think in Severance, the Severance procedure itself, especially for the innie counterpart, functions exactly like the river Lethe. It forces forgetfulness between your past life. It creates a new personality of the innie, a rebirth, if you will, where the soul doesn't retain any memory of their past existence. And I think this has also been shown to us visually in the show. With the painting, Kier invites you to drink of his water, which again, I explored in my episode 5 video, as it shows Kier overlooking what seems to look like the Great Lakes in North America. And I said I think that these 5 Great Lakes that exist in real life are being depicted in the painting, but I think symbolically, thematically, they represent the 5 rivers of the underworld. So Kier is like overlooking the 5 rivers of the underworld, and he is inviting you to drink of his water. He's inviting you to drink from the river Lethe. And this painting's obviously hung up on the severed floor for the innies to see. So it's saying like, I have invited you to drink from this river of forgetfulness so that you are now reborn as a new person, this innie that doesn't remember their past. Now, we're going down to the 4th layer, where I'm going to introduce you to Orphism, a religion philosophy from ancient Greece, which was attributed to Orpheus, the musician and poet. Now, Orphic beliefs revolved around the immortality and purification of the soul, emphasizing reincarnation and the afterlife. Now, Orphism as a religion focused on the soul's journey through death and rebirth, and they taught that the soul was trapped in a cycle of reincarnation. They shared their belief was that after death, souls traveled to the underworld, to Hades, where they would encounter 2 rivers. First, the river Lethe of forgetfulness, which we have of course just explored. And they taught that drinking from the river Lethe would erase memory and force the soul into reincarnation. And this was a part of the natural cycle of rebirth, unless the soul could escape it. Now they said there was also a second river, the river Mnemosyne, which was the river of memory, and that drinking from it would allow the soul to retain its past knowledge and escape the cycle, achieving a higher spiritual state, almost like reaching the divine. Now, I only just found out about this as I was researching for this video, so this was so crazy to find out there's like a secret 6th river of the underworld. Like, hey, wake up, new underworld river just dropped. So now that I've been introduced to this whole 6th river of memory, I now think we have seen Mark drink from this river. He has chosen to now drink from the river of memory instead by choosing to go through with reintegration. And this choice also stops reincarnation from happening. And what does this sound like? This sounds like the whole Bardo, Thodol, and the death cycles that we explored in my last video for episode 7, where I shared it seemed like in the episode we were witnessing both Mark and Gemma going through different stages of the Bardos of death. And I was saying how I think Mark was going through the Chakai Bardo, and that if you're able to wake up from it, you become enlightened, and like your mind becomes 9 times as clear as it once was. So now I believe that Mark not only was able to escape the death cycle and become enlightened, but he also obviously avoided this forced rebirth reincarnation, which also ties into drinking from the river of memory and choosing to remember instead of forget, which stops the cycle of rebirth in this whole Greek mythology aspect. And listen to this additional connection I found as well. I found this blog post that was talking about the 6th river, the river of memory. And they said, to forget or to remember, going back to Plato and his Legend of these are the 2 questions every soul has to answer for themselves. They not only define who we were, but more importantly, they predicate who we'll be. There are many parallels with the Bardo Thodol, commonly known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. There has been a slew of recent scholarship on the potential cultural transmission between the Greek and Buddhist worlds, and they say they'll save that for a different post or rant, and that the point is the notions of forgetting and remembering are central to both worldviews. And I mean, I'm sorry, but this person has basically just put all of my little connections to all the Buddhism, Greek mythology stuff, and the whole core theme of Severance of like, who are you? Together. How crazy is that? And just since this blog post mentioned Plato's myth of I'll just quickly mention, this also obviously ties into Severance. And in the myth of Plato describes how souls, before being reincarnated, must choose between drinking from the river Lethe of forgetting or retaining their memories. So souls who drink too much from Lethe forget everything and are trapped in this cycle of rebirth, repeating the same mistakes over and over. But those who manage to remember, so metaphorically, drink from the river of memory instead, are able to gain knowledge beyond their temporary existence and escape the cycle. So as I said, I think this is exactly what is now happening with Mark's reintegration, and his choice of choosing to remember instead of forget and being able to escape from this rebirth cycle. But now, let us go down to the final layer of this theory iceberg here. Layer 5, where I decided to do a bit of research into other works of literature that mentioned either ether, the chemical substance, or its Greek mythological counterpart of the river Lethe, and see if there were any other connections to what we're seeing in Severance. Now, the first literature piece I'm going to share with you has some very interesting symbolic connections to Severance. Now, ether was the subject of a short story titled Dreams from 1882 by a guy whose name I hopefully won't butcher the pronunciation of, which is Diethyl, which is about a group of tired and bored dinner guests who feel stuck in life, struggling with sleepless nights and bad dreams. One of them, a doctor, tells them that a real pleasant dreaming experience can be brought on by modern medicine. The other guests think that he's just talking about other drugs that they've already tried. However, the doctor surprises them by saying that he's talking about ether. He says how he first used it to treat nerve pain, but later started using it more often. He explains that by lying down and slowly breathing in ether, his body enters a strange dreamlike state where his body became light, as if the flesh and bones had been melted and only the skin was left. The skin necessary to enable me to realize the sweetness of living, the bathing in this sensation of well-being. Then I perceived that I was no longer suffering. The pain had gone, melted away, evaporated. And I heard voices, 4 voices, 2 dialogues, without understanding what was said. Guys, did you notice the big thing there? 4 voices, 2 dialogues, 4 voices, like the 4 tempers, and 2 dialogues, like innie and outie. Like this, I don't think this can be a coincidence, right? This has to be mirroring exactly what Kier Eagan, high on ether, experienced. Hence the concept of needing to tame the 4 tempers, taming these 4 voices and controlling these 2 different dialogues, these 2 sides of himself, the innie and outie. I seriously do not think this is a coincidence. I think I'm really unraveling the whole history of what happened to Kier and the whole 4 tempers stuff, and it all is related to ether. Now, another literary work that I found that I think has some more interesting connections is Aldous Huxley's The Door of Perception from 1954, which is an autobiographical essay where Huxley explores his experiences with mescaline and how the nature of human perception combined with substances like mescaline can alter consciousness, allowing people to see the world in a way that is usually blocked by the brain's reducing valve. He argues that our normal perception is highly filtered, keeping us from experiencing reality in its full depth. And how does this idea connect to the river of forgetfulness and the river of memory? Well, mescaline is a psychedelic like LSD, and this could represent the river of memory, as it allows people to expand their awareness and dissolve the filters that limit perception, allowing people to experience reality in a heightened state. And although it's not directly mentioned, but Ether is obviously the river of forgetfulness counterpart to this, which instead of opening up people's perception, it dulls and distorts it. So it reduces awareness, erases memory, and creates a disconnected dreamlike state instead. And when I searched for this book on Google, look at what image of the book cover was shown to me. Are you seeing this? This is what is shown in the Severance intro of Cobel's face being hollowed out. This book cover has a face hollowed out, and that matches exactly what we see in the intro of Cobel's face being hollowed out. What does it mean? What does this mean? Now, this cover art on the Doors of Perception suggests that someone stands at the boundary between blindness and awareness, between being controlled and being free. And of course, all of that sounds like Severance as well, like Doors of Perception, all the doors on the severed floor, all of it. But specifically this imagery that we see in the intro sequence, so we see Cobel looking down at a book, and inside the book is where the severed workers are on the severed floor. And it's as if their entire existence is something she has written, studied, and orchestrated, which obviously we now have found out essentially is, since she's the inventor, creator of the Severance chip. And then we see her lift her face and see how her face is just this hollow circle. And if this is to match the book cover's imagery, is this showing us this is like perception itself being altered, erased, or redefined? Like, it feels like this moment in the intro is visually showing us her role as the architect of Severance. So maybe the imagery symbolism is showing us that she's the one standing at the threshold of perception, as the gatekeeper deciding who remains blind and who might one day see, like the gatekeeper of deciding who gets to drink from the river of memory. Now, I of course have not had a chance to read this book before recording all of this, so I'd be really interested to hear if anyone who's listening to this, if anyone has read this book, what do you think this means? Like, what do you think this means of us seeing Cobel's hollowed out face matching the book cover? Like, what does this mean for Cobel's role in this story and what might happen with her going forward? I would be really, really interested to hear others' thoughts on this. But ultimately, as I've explored in this deep dive theory iceberg with you, throughout history, scientifically, across literature, mythology, and philosophy, these same ideas keep resurfacing. The idea that consciousness is fragile, easily manipulated, and dangerously subject to external control. Whether through forced forgetfulness, like the Severance chip, distorted perception, like the drug ether, or the river Lethe's power to erase memory, it all comes back to one thing: subduing people and reshaping reality in the hands of those who hold the power. And given all of these deep literary and historical connections, I think Severance is building towards a profound reckoning, one that's centered on memory, control, and I think maybe the consequences of reintegration. Mark's journey now with reintegration seems to be mirroring the Orphistic path, the choice between drinking from the river of forgetfulness or the river of memory. Him making the choice to reintegrate suggests he is now being forced towards a truth that is irreversible. And then there's the Lumon and Kier ether references that seem to all have a deeper meaning. Beyond just symbolism, they seem to be woven into the company's actual history, philosophy, and scientific experiments. And then we have the literary parallels that warn about full awareness potentially coming at a terrible price. Those who drink from the river of memory see everything, but some truth can never be unseen. So if Mark is now going to be reintegrated, Is he going to actually gain freedom, or is he going to be uncovering something he was never meant to know? And what if seeing everything means that you're faced to see things you never wanted to see or never should have seen? So in the end, what does this episode's title, Sweet Vitriol, really mean? In Severance, I think Ether's history is more than just a reference to a drug. I see it as a warning. A warning that forgetting, while it can be comforting, even merciful, can also be dangerous. And the themes of this show connect to humanity's oldest fears about memory, identity, and control. The Severance procedure is our modern-day River Lethe, a contemporary ether anesthesia, forcing a chemical forgetting while raising the eternal question. Is forgetting a mercy that protects us from suffering? Or is it a prison that prevents us from truly knowing ourselves? Because when you control what people remember and what they forget, you control them entirely. But those are just all of my thoughts and theories about the latest episode of Severance. But let me know what you think. Do you agree with the things I shared in this video? Were there any hidden details or secret symbolism that stood out to you the most? Whatever thoughts you have, just be sure to let me know in the comments below, as I feel like I covered a lot of really interesting connections in this video, so it'll be interesting to see what things stuck out to you the most. And be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, as that lets the algorithm know you'd like to see more of my videos as I continue covering Severance throughout Season 2 and beyond. And now, if you've made it to the end of this video, congratulations! You have now reached 100% on your file. A handshake is available upon request. And remember,
I love you, but now I must away, for there are others who need me around the world. Goodbye.